It began with swagger, take back control. But 5 years later, Britain is crawling back to Europe, bruised, broken, and barely taken seriously. The dream of sovereignty has collapsed into spreadsheets, shortages, and shame. Today, the UK isn't leading talks, it's begging for a seat back at the table. But Europe? It's not holding the door open. Brexit was meant to mark a bold new era. Instead, it marked the beginning of Britain's slow decline, from one of Europe's leading voices to its most complicated neighbour. Now, with public support for rejoining at an all-time high, the question is back on the table. Could the UK really return to the EU? And if it tries, what humiliations might lie ahead? In this video, we'll trace the dramatic downfall of Brexit Britain, lost trade, lost power, and now lost pride. We'll uncover the real cost of going solo, the legal nightmares of crawling back, and how, in 2025, the once mighty UK finds itself not negotiating, but pleading. This is not just an economic story, it's an identity crisis, and Europe is watching. Once the bold rebel that walked out of Europe with chest puffed and slogans blazing, Britain now finds itself in a position that's hard to dress up, humiliated, cornered, and eyeing the very door it slammed shut. The idea of rejoining the EU is now a whisper growing louder in Westminster's halls. Of course, some are already calling it what it looks like, begging to come back. Peter Mandelson, Labour veteran, EU insider and seasoned political operator, has dropped a bombshell. He says the UK could begin talks to return to the European Union in just 10 years. That's not a casual prediction. It's a shot across the bow from someone who knows both sides of the channel better than most. But here's the thing. The EU would need to want Britain back. This isn't a one-sided decision. Britain doesn't just get to show up and ask for its old seat. It needs to be invited. It needs to be welcomed. And right now, that door? It's not exactly swinging wide open. But Brexit isn't the only reason the UK's economy is struggling. Mandelson pointed to another problem: chronic underinvestment. Since 2011, especially under Conservative leadership, the UK has failed to invest sufficiently in its future. By 2025, the UK is the only G7 nation where investment remains below 20% of GDP. That's a disgrace, for sure. This is clearly shown in the graph below, where the line representing the UK shamefully falls below every other country's. The economic stagnation, he argued, didn't begin with Brexit, but Brexit made everything worse. Plus, the deal struck by Boris Johnson? Mandelson believes it only raised barriers between the UK and its largest and closest trading partner, dragging down productivity and growth. Fixing that damage, he said, should be the government's focus right now. Mandelson's timeline is bold, but to grasp why a fresh start might even be on the table, we need to rewind to where it all began. The moment that tore Britain in two and set the stage for today's debate. On January 31st, 2020, the UK officially walked out of the European Union. After 47 years in the European Union, the UK turned its back on the bloc and walked away, convinced it was stepping into a bold, sovereign future. What followed wasn't a celebration, but a slow-motion crisis, one that completely shattered the UK. But let's be clear, the break didn't actually happen overnight. For 11 more months, Britain clung to the EU single market and customs union. Behind the scenes, chaos was merely delayed, not avoided. Then came the Northern Ireland Protocol. This wasn't just a policy shift, it was a national identity crisis. Brexit tore through the country. Families split, political parties imploded, and every election, every headline boiled down to one thing: in or out. Now it's 2025, and guess what? The dust still hasn't settled. It was clear the UK knew it had pushed itself to the edge, and now it's glancing back, wondering if maybe, just maybe, it should beg to be let back in. But the real question is, has the situation really been that bad? The answer is yes, and it had a lot to do with the UK's trade problems after Brexit. Imagine this: you've just made a major business decision, a bold move to go your own way. The idea of freedom sounds great, but suddenly, you're buried under paperwork, hit with delays, and your costs are soaring. That's the reality many UK businesses are facing post-Brexit. This was supposed to be the easy part. Trade, they said, would carry on. No tariffs, no barriers, no problem. Instead, what followed was a bureaucratic nightmare that businesses are still waking up from. Proud UK exporters, companies that once moved goods across Europe with ease, were now trapped in a web of customs forms, shipping delays, and skyrocketing costs. The dream was gone. What's left is shame, frustration, and decline. Since leaving the EU Single Market and Customs Union in January 2021, Britain's once thriving trade networks have been suffocating under red tape. The promises of frictionless trade turned out to be false. What actually arrived were non-tariff barriers that crippled supply chains and drove exporters to the edge. Just take a look at the red line in this graph. It represents goods exports, and it's been on a steady downward slope since 2018. That stubborn decline isn't just a coincidence, it's a reflection of the mounting non-tariff barriers that have made trading with the EU slower, more expensive, and far less predictable. Despite promises of prosperity, the line tells a very different story, one of a nation struggling to regain its footing in global trade. The UK, once proud, now finds itself at the mercy of its own self-inflicted wounds. But the damage doesn't stop there. It was once effortless. A UK-based fashion label could design, produce, and ship to Paris, Milan, Berlin. No customs, no chaos, no questions asked. But that was before. In 2019, Britain exported $9.1 billion worth of clothing and footwear to the EU. It was fast, it was lucrative, and it was deeply embedded in the heartbeat of Europe's fashion world. By 2023, that number had collapsed to just $3.4 billion. That's not a dip, that's a disaster. What used to take days now takes weeks. What used to cost pennies now bleeds profits. In an industry where speed is survival, many UK retailers have decided it's simply not worth it anymore. The Office for Budget Responsibility, the government's independent forecaster, hasn't budgeted since 2016. Brexit's long-term impact on the UK's economy is expected to be negative, with trade in both goods and services set to drop by 15% in the long run. Now, as you watch these two graphs, one for goods trade and the other for services trade, keep an eye on the lines. The blue line represents the UK. The yellow line is the average for other G7 countries. Start with the goods trade chart on the left. Do you see that sharp drop after 2019? That's the UK falling behind. While other G7 countries managed to recover after the COVID shock in 2020, the UK's line keeps dipping. By 2023, it's well below 2019 levels. The UK is now fighting a losing battle, stuck in reverse. Now shift to the services trade on the right. For a while, the UK looked like it might catch up. But if you look closely, while other G7 countries, represented by the yellow line, continue to rise, the UK, represented by the blue line, starts to dip again by 2023. This is not global turbulence. This is Britain getting left behind. The worst part is that it knows, but there's barely anything they can do about it. The OBR estimates this will knock the size of the UK economy down by 4%, or about $126 billion in today's money. That's a staggering price to pay for a fresh start that's turning out to be anything but. The government has been touting its new agreements with countries like Australia, New Zealand, India, and the US as proof that Brexit will pay off in the long run. But here's the cold hard truth. These deals are not the saviors the UK had hoped for. In fact, the combined economic benefits of these new deals would only be about 14% of the losses caused by Brexit. Yes, 14%. That's less than a fifth of what the UK has lost in trade with its nearest and largest market, the EU. So what does this all mean? For the UK economy, the road ahead remains rocky. Just when some hoped that sector-specific struggles were isolated incidents, a broader truth became clear. The UK's entire trade recovery was falling behind across the board. The UK's post-pandemic trade recovery hasn't just been slow, it's been noticeably weaker than that of its global peers. If you take a look at this graph, you can see just how quickly the blue and yellow lines, representing the United States and Euro countries, were able to pick themselves up economically following 2020. Meanwhile, the UK, represented by the red line, was sinking even lower, trapped in a seemingly endless slump. It's not just slower, it's stuck, dragging behind like an anchor. So what was the price of this underperformance? UK trade as a share of GDP dropped by 11% between 2019 and late 2021. That's a far steeper drop than either the United States or the Eurozone. In a global race to recover, the UK is the country fumbling at the starting line, while the others have already rounded the first corner. This is about Brexit and the damage it continues to inflict, quietly, relentlessly, and often out of sight. Now, Britain is stuck with money it owes, and it can't seem to back out. Before Brexit, the UK contributed a significant chunk of money to the European Union. In the 2019 to 2020 financial year, the UK's contribution to the EU budget was a hefty $22.8 billion, or about $451 million every week. That money went into the EU's pot, helping fund various projects across Europe. But here's the thing, much of that money came right back to the UK. British farms benefited from the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, and economically struggling regions got structural funding to boost skills, training, and employment. In total, the UK received about $6.64 billion in these payouts in 2019 to 2020. Fast forward to 2021, and the UK stopped paying into the EU budget. No more weekly $451 million contributions. So, did Brexit save the UK money? Well, sort of. The UK government replaced EU payments with its own funds. For instance, British farmers now get direct payments from the UK government instead of the EU. Likewise, the EU structural funds were replaced by the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which aims to do the same thing, just without the EU. But even though the UK has officially severed its ties with the EU, the financial connections are far from over. As part of the Brexit withdrawal agreement, the UK agreed to a financial settlement, and the payments are still rolling in. From 2024 onwards, the UK will continue paying an estimated $8.5 billion, but these payments will be stretched out over several years. Now, money is only part of the story. Brexit, with all its lofty promises, has transformed the UK from a nation that once stood tall on the global stage into a pathetic shadow of itself. The path to rejoining the European Union is anything but simple. Legal and institutional roadblocks stand in the way, each demanding years of negotiation and overhaul. The Acquis Communautaire is the complete set of EU laws and regulations that all member states must adhere to. We're talking about 35 chapters, everything from trade and competition to environmental standards and consumer protection. Since Brexit, the UK has been charting its own course, implementing laws that diverge from EU standards. For instance, the Retained EU Law Act of 2023 gives the UK the ability to revoke or amend laws that were previously retained from the EU. If the UK were to rejoin the EU, it would have to crawl back through that legal door it once slammed. Turning next to the question of money, the issue of the euro. The symbol of British pride, the currency that once stood as a marker of its unshakable independence, would be nothing more than a relic of a bygone era. What could be more degrading than to see Britain, once the ruling empire, forced to adapt the euro, the very currency it once denounced as the downfall of European unity? It's the ultimate slap in the face to everything the UK once believed it stood for. The pound, now a symbol of pride, would be discarded, and the UK would be forced to accept the euro, a reminder that it's no longer the master of its own fate. Back when the UK was a member, it had a special opt-out from adopting the euro, maintaining the pound sterling as its currency. But now, after Brexit, that opt-out is meaningless. Rejoining the EU would almost certainly mean the UK would have to give up the pound and adopt the euro, a humiliating blow to national pride. But the humiliation doesn't stop there. To even consider rejoining the EU, the UK must meet the Maastricht criteria, financial standards it had long ignored and shattered. These include keeping inflation rates within 1.5 percentage points of the three best performing EU countries, maintaining a government budget deficit of no higher than 3% of GDP, and ensuring the government debt does not exceed 60% of GDP. But here's the thing, for many, the prospect of surrendering the pound sterling is a non-starter. Ultimately, the legal chaos, the bitter pill of abandoning the pound, and the forced surrender of its borders would reduce the UK to little more than a beggar at the UK's door, begging for re-entry. Yet, amidst all the fallout, there may still be something worth salvaging. Public opinion is shifting. As of 2024, 60% of Britons believe Brexit has gone badly, according to a YouGov poll. Even more telling, a record 63% of young people aged 18 to 24 now say the UK should rejoin the EU. A generational shift that signals a quiet but powerful change in the national mood. Yes, the path back will be steep, but at the end of the road lies more than just a re-entry into the trade bloc. It's a chance to return, not as the empire the UK once imagined itself to be, but as a credible, committed partner. One that Europe can respect, one that the world can take seriously again.